that off of there. And here we are, ladies and gentlemen. I am speaking to you now from approximately about a half second in the future. I am, of course, the Mighty Pong.
I'm Crux.
And our special guests tonight are...
Xenify.
And...
Ugly Man.
Fantastic. Now, we have an action-packed show for you tonight, despite the fact that my video is lagged out for some reason I don't know. We are going to be talking about a tale of two copyrights. One of electronic circuits, the other of audio. Now, if you guys were around for, let's see, about 5 episodes ago, it was episode, I want to say 18, called A Lot of If Statements, we got a copyright violation. Not a strike, it's the other thing. I can't remember what it was. But we got one of those. So we're going to talk about that in the second half. And it was awesome. But first, before we go there, an announcement on the shop. We are, of course, located at 1075 American Pacific Drive, and that's Suite C in fabulous Henderson, Nevada. Now, unless you remember, you're going to have to wait a little bit to come check out the shop. Right now, we're closed to the public, but we'd like to remind you that while we're closed to the public, you are in a shared space elsewhere. Make sure that you clean all of your tools, surfaces, and materials before and after you use them. Make sure that you do what you can in order to limit exposure and to yourself and others. Stay home, don't touch your face, and for Pete's sake, wash your damn hands. So through everybody helping out a little bit.
Wear a mask when you're out in public.
You know what? I haven't added that yet. Yes.
Yeah.
Wear a mask when you're out in public, for the love of God. But yeah.
I'll just go ahead, finish your thing.
No, that's fine. So to stay updated on the shop's open status, you can head over to cinshop.org/COVID status, and you can find out the latest information there. And to make sure you're notified of our future events, including virtual ones just like this, you can join us at meetup.com/cinshop. So, a tale of two copyrights. So before we get to the stuff of our copyright junk, I want to introduce our guest here. This is Ugly Man. How did you find out about the shop, first of all?
You know, I was doing research before moving here. I moved here a year and a half ago, and I had about a year where I knew I was coming down, and so I had done research, and so I knew about the shop then. I had kind of known that that would be the places we would go check out when we got here, and pleasantly surprised to find what we found there.
Awesome. So about a year and a half you guys have known about it then?
Yeah, something like that.
Very cool. So what's your favorite thing about the shop? Like, what's kept you coming back?
I think that, you know, I haven't, you know, moving here, things are a little chaotic when you move and all of that. And so I haven't been settled in and doing projects and stuff like that. But what we have gained is, you know, some of the first friendships that we made here in town were there. Have had such, you know, great conversations there, and have learned a lot just from kind of chatting with people around there. So it's been a huge benefit to us so far.
That's really cool. Yeah, I think you first told me the story that you're about to tell our guests. You told that to me, I would say probably about a year ago, wasn't it? And
that could be about right.
Yeah, so I used to use Mackie stuff a lot, and you know, ever since I started the show, I've been thinking about having you on, and this whole copyright thing provided the perfect opportunity to have you on, because your story about the early days of Mackie dovetails perfectly. Well, I guess kind of the end times of Mackie, but dovetailed perfectly with our copyright story that we're having here. So so it's going to be fantastic to hear this. So I'm going to stop talking here. Set the stage for us. When and where are we talking about here?
Okay, so I grew up in Bothell, Washington, north of Seattle. One town over is Woodinville. Woodinville had a valley full of electronics factories and things like that. There was medical devices, there was audio electronics, there was all kinds of stuff like that. And growing up in the 80s and 90s, if you were up there, you know, near Microsoft, near Amazon, near all these things that were, you know, the .com craziness, you know, if you had any interest in electronics or computers, you were certainly encouraged to go down that road. And you know, I was interested in all of that. You know, I was an electronics hobbyist when I was a kid, and I was a guitar player. And at some point I was looking at a guitar magazine in the mid 90s, and I saw a Mackie advertisement for that 1202 mixer that, was the first mixer that a regular person could afford to put in their bedroom, and really had good quality. And
Mm-hmm.
so it was really exciting to see the address at the bottom of that was just over in Woodinville. I knew I wanted to work there, and I actually picked up the phone and called them and tried to get a job there, and they said, well, you have to be 18 to work here, and I wasn't yet. So I stayed in touch. I kept calling them back, kept sending them resumes and trying to get in there. That late 90s era was, Mackie was booming. They were selling those compact mixers like crazy. This company, I eventually learned, had been started in Greg Mackey's condo, and a guy that became, one of my best friends in the world just passed away in the last year or so. It was Tom Johnson, and he was one of Greg Mackey's first employees that sat in his 3-bedroom condo making audio mixers. When I worked there, about 2000, I got a job there. I worked there for a couple of years until they moved the factory to China. But when I worked there, they were rolling out the Mackie digital products, and it was, shifting gears, trying to make things work. And they were up against this battle that we're going to talk about, and some other, sort of conditions in the marketplace at the time.
Yeah. So I was actually thinking about that. When was that? I guess yesterday or earlier today, about back whenever I was first getting into music and all that stuff. Mackie was to me, was the first like professional grade stuff that was attainable, not easily attainable. It wasn't cheap, but it was attainable. Like if I had enough successful gigs, or if I, mowed lawns, or, did enough telemarketing, I could afford a Mackie mixer and have something that was really, really solid. I talked about that a little bit on last Monday. On our we do a project stream on Mondays at 7:30 Pacific as well. But I was talking a little bit about some of the designs, like the way that they do the way they have the pots supported, going directly into the circuit board rather than coming in from the side at a 90-degree angle. What else set them apart at the time? Like, just to kind of so people understand like what we had essentially.
Yeah, some of what made Mackie unique was the fact that they were made in America in a state-of-the-art factory with some extremely skilled people working on that stuff. It was really sort of a bizarre thing by today's standards. It's not something that you would see now, that a $400-$500 audio mixer would be made by the level of skill that was in that factory. We had a state-of-the-art metal shop that was, from what I understand, was kind of world renowned for some of the things that we were doing in that metal shop. You have to be extremely precise when you stamp out the chassis for an audio mixer, because a 32.8 had something like 500 knobs on it, so you had to cut 500 little holes. If you could cut them tighter to fit around the shafts of those pots, you wouldn't get as much dust into those pots. And so getting those tolerances as tight as possible, and then you add a little bit of paint, you add a little bit of silk screen. There's all these opportunities to mess up that tolerance. The precision that was going on there, considering that these were relatively inexpensive products, was really something that had never been done before for the audio industry.
So what was what made that how do I put this? What made that possible? Was it automation of the factory? Was it, just people that were really good at drilling holes? Like, what was it that made that possible?
So they really, by the time I worked there, they had a lot of automation in that metal shop. And actually, one of the mechanics over there pulled me aside. It was probably the summer of 2000, and he said, "Have you ever had a tour of our metal shop?" I said, "No," and he took me over there, and I was excited to see it. We had about 4 buildings there. There was 2 big buildings that were entirely Mackie, and then we had kind of partial spaces for the service shop for warranty support and stuff like that. And there was a design engineering area down there too. But we went over to the metal shop, which was also the building where they built the speakers, like the SRM 450s and stuff like that. And we and the HR 824s, the little studio monitors that everybody loved. And I see
whenever I'd go to a show and they had those Mackie stage monitors, that made my night. I tell you, like that was.
Well, I personally built and tested a lot of the SRM 450s. That was a miserable line to work on because the tester had to actually empty those things out of the box that were stacked taller than me. I'm a pretty tall guy, and you had to empty those boxes and get those things on the line. Then you had to run to the far end of the assembly line to test them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why the line was designed that way, but anyway,
Efficiency.
it was efficient for somebody, just not for the tester.
Right.
But,
Yeah.
it was a fantastic product. It was those were great.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Anyway, I was saying about the metal shop, the mechanic, my anecdote about the sort of level of technology that they had at the time. The mechanic told me that at night, if he was on call, if he was the official guy on call, it would automatically know, how to get a hold of him, and it would actually call him, and this robotic sort of voice would tell him, I need more metal, and he would know that he needs to drive down there and get on the forklift and load some more magazines of metal into that machine.
Wow.
To do that now is not impressive at all, but to do that, I mean, you could do that for $50 from Home Depot now or whatever, but back then in 2000, that was a kind of a remarkable, quirky design.
Yeah, exactly. I was just about to say 20 years ago, that's a little bit more than a Raspberry Pi.
Yeah.
So,
Cool.
Oh, go ahead.
That was pretty cool. Yeah, I mean, I never really thought about that. I have servers that would message me or something like that saying if they're okay, but not like a call.
Yeah. And
I can give you an idea just quickly. That metal shop, it had magazines of metal. These huge magazines of sheet metal would come in. It's like a pallet of metal. They would slap that in with a forklift. It would run through the first machine, and it was like an amazing process where one die would come down and stamp all the holes for multiple mixer chassis. It was like a grid of audio mixers would just appear right before your eyes when that machine stamped it. It would roll to the next part of the machine, and then it would automatically fold the sides. And then a guy would just pick those up and hang them on a hook, and it would go through the paint shop, which would take that hook, I think, 24 hours to go through the paint shop, to go through all the steps. And then a guy at the end would pull it off that hook and put it on the silkscreen machine. And that was how all of those were built.
That's amazing. So did having all that in-house lead to them being able to innovate faster? Because that's one thing I heard with like Adafruit. One of the reasons they put all their manufacturing in Brooklyn is because they got tired of the back and forth between them and, dealing with overseas. So did that help innovation wise?
So my role with the company, I came in and worked a little short time as an assembler, and then I worked as a tester, final tester, and I got pulled in to do the pilot runs on the digital products. And so just by luck, I happened to, come into the company with some computer experience, and they were doing the HDR 2496 was the 24 track digital recording. It was hard disk recording. It was a new idea at the time, sort of. And so
that was
because we did good on that pilot run.
Super fast. Was that basically competing with like the Roland VS 880, I want to say?
I don't know what model numbers or whatever, but yeah, there were similar products at the time. The HDR came out about 2000. I tested the first 50 units or so off the line. And then I trained the other testers and worked with them for the first couple thousand. At that point, I ended up testing, I think, pretty much all of the digital products. I tested the pilot runs for all their new products for the next couple of years, just for the digital stuff. I did some analog testing for 32.8 and stuff like that, the analog boards, but and I did some 1604s and some other things too. But yeah, the hard disk recorder, it was the HDR and then the MDR and then the SDR. And what was interesting was, you asked about that innovation part. They started buying companies around this time. Things were kind of in a tailspin at that moment, in time. And so they were buying, I think, Acuma Labs in Belgium, if I remember right. RCF was a transducer manufacturer in Italy, EAW in Chicago. Those acquisitions happened while I was there, and I sort of saw, some of it was buying sort of the ability to make these new things. We had a sync board in the HDR that came from Acuma that I don't think we would have been able to make in-house.
And EAW, I have not heard that, like the Obi-Wan Kenobi meme. Now there's a name I haven't heard in a long time.
Yeah.
EAW. I remember those were decent. They weren't nearly as phenomenal as the Mackie stuff was, but they were decent.
It's my understanding that they made the actual speakers that went in the SRM 450, and that was why we bought them.
Oh, okay. All right.
And the transducers came from RCF, and the housings I think came from RCF. If I remember right, when we were pulling those SRM 450s off the pallet to mount the amplifier was made in Woodinville, and we would put that all together on the assembly line. But the speakers came pre-mounted in the housings, and I think that they had already visited Italy and Chicago before they got to us, or maybe the speakers from Chicago were sent to Italy. There was some story like that of how that worked. I can't remember now.
Wow. So what was the advantage of sending them, from here to there? I guess that happened to be where they already had the speaker manufacturing place, and the other place already had the amplifier stuff. Because they were just to fill in anybody that's not familiar with the speakers that we're talking about. If you go to a wedding, a lot of times these are the kind of speakers that you'll see on two poles on either side of the DJ. That's the kind of speakers that we're talking about. They're basically stage monitors, but some people do use them as PAs, and the particular model that he's talking about, you would have no problem using them to provide
So
sound.
they have an amplifier built in, or
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'm familiar with that
Yeah.
style.
Yeah, I don't know why they did it that way, but I think that it had to do with, logistics was different 20 years ago than it is now. And I think that Mackie products entered the distribution channel sort of from that Woodinville warehouse. And I think it made sense to sort of finish them up there and have us look at them, have the regular testers do them. They were building the amplifiers in our factory. And like everything that we did pretty much there, almost everything that we did there was, components were hand loaded onto those circuit boards. The flow solder machines were there. We had the surface mount soldering department, did all of that work there. That was all in-house stuff. There's about 600 people, give or take, working there when I was there, I think.
So I was going to ask that. So there were about 600 people at that. Like,
that's the number that I remember going around, and I don't know if that included like the warranty department and the design engineers. I don't know if it was probably between 550 and 800, but the number of people always said was 600.
Oh, very cool. Well, that's awesome. So what was the atmosphere like at the time? Was it, was everybody living high on the hog? But you were saying that they would already start to have some problems. Like what started to happen? What started going wrong?
It's a weird moment in my sort of personal timeline, because it was a dream come true for me. But things had already started to go wrong by the time I was there. People that I met early on would sort of pull me aside and be like, oh, you missed the good old days when Greg Mackie would walk around and hand $100 bills to everybody or whatever. But I got to know a lot of those stories because my friend Tom that I mentioned before, I spent a lot of nights having a few drinks with Tom in his condo in Woodinville there right down the road from the factory. And he told me all those stories of how because he had seen the entire, rise and fall of the company. He was there for the whole ride. And so I got a lot of insight into how that all went. And it had been everybody's dream come true at one point. But, for me, I wanted to work there because I was a guitar player. But more than that, I wanted to work there because it was electronics, and I loved electronics. And when I was a kid and I would look in those electronics magazines and I'd see an advertisement for an oscilloscope and they'd have some lab coat guy standing next to it, I think that's what I want to do when I grow up. I didn't know what that job was. Well, I ended up having that job when I was about 19, and I was working as a tester in that factory. I had all that test gear that I had always dreamed of was right in front of me, and I had a lot of fun doing it. But things were starting to change. The factory was a very upbeat, happy place to work. It was about 95% Southeast Asian people working there.
Mm-hmm.
The lines were sort of divided by language a little bit. So I worked with a Laotian family on the HDR line, and ate grandma's sticky rice a couple times a day, and just had a great time. Just so much to learn in a situation like that. It was awesome. But it wasn't too long before, we were delisted from the NASDAQ, and there was, layoffs starting, and a factory spinning up in China, and all that other stuff was sort of looming.
Yeah.
And the whole time I worked there, we kind of knew maybe that was coming. But it was great times up until it actually started to happen.
Sure. So what was your first sign that things were starting to go a little bit sideways?
You know, we were believing that those digital products were going to change the course of the company and sort of save us. Like the people working on the floor, I think, you know, the digital 8 bus was a real revolutionary piece. That was there before I was there. The HDR 2496 sort of was when they were getting into a whole line of digital products.
So real quick,
and they thought, I think, that that was going to swing things in the right direction.
real quick, I just want to like for historical purposes here, just
Yeah.
just to because right now I can pop open my Chromebook and record. I can't do 8 streams simultaneously, but you know what I'm saying. I can pop
Yeah.
up just about any notebook and have 8 different streams recording. But 20 years ago, your best bet for doing that was probably going to be like to tape at that time, you know? I guess you could mix 8 tracks through a mixer, but as far as recording each of 8 tracks separately and being able to do it digitally, that just wasn't a thing at the time, right? So what he's talking about is a big flipping deal. Like I remember when that and the VS880, a buddy of mine worked at a music store in Kansas City, and he had a VS880, and it was freaking revolutionary at the time, right? Because you know, I just wanted to make sure that like because saying, oh yeah, we could record 8 channels at once, people were like, okay, and you know, so I just wanted to make sure that people understood at 20 years ago that was a big deal. But anyway, go
Well,
ahead.
and I can give you an idea. That product cost about $5,000. Plus, you'd have to buy some I/O cards and stuff. It was one of the more expensive products that Mackie ever came up with. But the thing about it was that it could record at 44.1 or 48 kilohertz. It could record all 24 tracks at the same time.
Mhm.
This was with, I think, if I remember right, it was like a 433 Celeron processor. So that's a pretty impressive thing. It had a custom operating system that our guys had come up with. It was a very new world, and they had a lot of problems growing into the sort of digital side of things because this was a company that had only ever designed analog things. They had never dealt with ESD before. They had never had electrostatic discharge be an issue on any of the components that you don't build an analog mixer out of very sensitive stuff. So they were having problems with, what do you mean this is the wrong kind of plastic for these bins that the parts sit in and all of that kind of stuff. And
we've been keeping our through-hole resistors in this metal bin for the past 10 years. You know, what's the problem?
Yeah. Never caused a problem. Yeah. So yeah, and that thing could do 96 kilohertz for 12 tracks, I think. It couldn't do 24.
So double CD quality, which again, at the time, you know, to have a computer that could even touch that, I'm not 100% sure you could.
I'm not sure what they were even doing with 96 at the time. Maybe some sort of video thing. I don't know.
That's the only thing I can think of. Or if you're, if anybody in the chat has the answer to this, please do let us know, because I'm super curious. Because when I was coming up at the time, you know, I was recording things to DAT tape to send off to have pressed, so I didn't care that much. I mean, yes, at 96K, yes, you're getting technically double the resolution of a CD, but I guess it's like trying to punk your audiophile friend that says he can tell when something's digital. I don't know.
Yeah, and you know, the HDR had a video output where it had a little kind of point and click interface that was pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
They came up with the MDR, which was the same product. It just didn't have the video card in it. It had a little software tweak, and it was much less expensive. But it was actually pretty much the same thing inside. Then they came up with the SDR. In that 2-year period, all those products came out, while I was working there. But the SDR, that was when it shifted. It was no longer an iTox motherboard with a Celeron processor. That was all custom Mackie circuit boards that we were making in-house. That was all stuff that was being manufactured right there in front of us.
Wow, that's amazing. So, go ahead. Oh, I didn't know if you had something.
No, I just said, huh.
Oh, yeah. So having all that there, so I guess going back to what I was saying before, having all that stuff in-house did let them iterate again and again and again. So that's where we left off. You had said that people were saying that was going to be what saved the company. People were like, oh yeah, this new thing. This is going to put us on the map, blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, we know that it, it was revolutionary. And we know that, especially at that price point, there was nothing else like it. So what happened?
Well, so there was a number of things that happened right around that time. And if you were involved with electronics manufacturing at the time, you know that a couple of the big forces was the shift to, WTO and NAFTA took place around then, where now a lot of these factories moved to China. There was, our competitors that, always were trying to make it hard on us. They went to China. Everybody went to China in the same year. It was really interesting to see, because we thought we had job security or career security sort of being in audio electronics in the Northwest where we were. Even in Woodinville, Symmetrics and Sunfire and all these other companies were just kind of right down the road. And we always heard that our buddies would get hired there after working at Mackie. It was no big deal. They'd get jobs at these other places. They all went to China in the same year.
Wow.
The contract manufacturing houses that were doing, the products that couldn't immediately go to China because of engineering issues, those contract houses, they went to Mexico when NAFTA started. So there was going to be this shift coming, but one of Mackie's sort of major, points of success was that factory that we talked about that was right next to the engineers in Woodinville. So, being able to have the design engineer walk into the factory and tap a tester on the shoulder like me and say, how does it sound? That's a huge advantage that they were taking advantage of all the way through the 90s. But at the same time, we had 9/11 was a big issue for audio because it was a big issue for the entertainment industry. So, there's a lot of things that changed with 9/11 and the recession that happened after it. The .com thing probably had a little bit of effect. There's all these sort of forces going on. But one of the big ones was this issue that you kind of want to talk about.
Well, actually, before we get to that, I did want to circle back, because everybody's heard of WTO and everyone's heard of NAFTA and all that stuff. What policy thing, or if you don't know this, that's totally cool. Like we're here to talk manufacturing, not necessarily, policy or whatever.
Yeah.
But what specific thing was it that flipped the dial to where everyone just all of a sudden dumped all their stuff into China at once?
So when those probably, I'm not an expert on this.
Sure.
I mean, at the time I was a dumb kid working in a factory and drinking too much and having the time of my life. But
I think we all were.
The thing about that was it changed the way that goods could be imported into the country. It sort of changed, I believe it sort of changed how the tariffs were charged and things like that, so that it made it financially viable to seek out the cheaper factories over there and the cheaper labor. It's my understanding that the guy who got my job, I was making about $150 a day at the time, and I think he made $150 a month. I was working 10-hour days, and he was working 14 to 16 hours a day and living in the factory. So it was a very different situation over there.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, so is essentially, well, I mean, it's always the money, but on this one specifically, it was the money. So real quick, I just want to take a super quick break. We're talking here with Ugly Man about the downfall of Mackie, and specifically about copyright, and that's the point we're going to get to in just a quick second here. But I did want to let everybody know that if you want to find out more information about the shop, go over to synshop.org, and you can find out about our physical space where you yourself can go and work on projects. It's freaking awesome. And also find out, not only when we're open, but also, what kind of equipment we have, stuff like that. Also, we are monitoring the chat. I do want to say a big thanks to McNutnut, who has subscribed with Twitch Prime. We appreciate it immensely. Thank you so much for that. Also, if you've got any comments for us, please leave it in the chat, and we will definitely read it. And if you'd like to ask any questions of our guest, anything like that, that would be awesome as well. And also, don't forget, in the second half, in the post game, we are going to talk about how I almost got us in a lot of trouble. But yeah, it's going to be, thanks. Oh, yes, and we have another subscription from Akeen. Thank you so much to Akeen. Thank you for subscribing. We really, really appreciate it. All right, so coming back to what we were talking about here, copyright. Here we go. Behringer. Dun, dun, dun. I thought about putting that on the soundboard, but I really hate soundboards at this point. Okay, so do you guys have anything to ask before we go forward?
Oh no,
Okay.
not really. I was just, at first I didn't even know what Mackie was. I'm just like I was like, all right, this would be a brand new story for me.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, they made the sound card that all this is running through, but they used to make really good mixers. In fact, that is a Mackie mixer right there. You can see it right there. Boop, Mackie mixer.
Oh.
That's one of the newer ones. And that reminds me,
Does it say Mackie on it, or does it just have the little logo?
it just has the logo. I wanted to ask you about that. Do you know the story behind that?
I don't know, but I heard a rumor that this company, since I worked there, has been, it was acquired by Loud Technologies, and they acquired a whole bunch of companies, and they've done a whole bunch of products, all manufactured in China, as far as I'm aware. A few of my old friends still work there and stuff. I'm in a Facebook group where at one point somebody told the sad story that one of these manufacturing contracts, they somehow managed to sign over the rights to the name Mackie, and so now the boards can't say Mackie; they just say the little Running Man logo instead.
Yeah, that's what mine has. It's a Mackie mixer, but it doesn't say Mackie anywhere on it. It's
Yeah, I heard that story on Facebook, and I thought that can't be true, and I went straight to a Guitar Center. Like I closed my laptop and went to Guitar Center, and I looked on the shelf and I saw a whole bunch of things that said designed in Woodinville, manufactured in China, and it had the Mackie logo but not the name. And I'm I'm still kind of struggling with that whole thing.
you gotta find out for us, like, if you can, like, what what the heck happened there, because that's got to be the biggest screw up I've ever heard of. Is someone, well, okay, maybe second, but someone just signing away their company's name. That's just ridiculous.
It's
I
pretty
don't know
hard
how
to
it
imagine.
happens.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, my guess is that somewhere in the world there's mixers that say Mackie and look just like the Mackie mixer that's at Guitar Center, and are probably made in the same factory, and probably they don't get a piece of that action.
Okay, so the main, well, not the not, well, yeah, the main event, I guess, Behringer. So what happened with them? So we've got, just to set the stage here, we've got all the jobs they're going overseas, and then here comes Behringer. Do I have the timeline right? Was it everybody starts making stuff over there, and then?
So it's my understanding. I came in the middle of the Behringer drama, and I don't know, because I was sort of oblivious to all of it. I was just excited to be there, and I was, really diving into learning what my job was and all that kind of stuff. And it really was one of the most rewarding jobs I've ever had, as far as, just a job where you go every day and learn more stuff. And at some point I heard somebody talking about this Behringer deal, and, it's a complicated story that I don't know when that started, but Behringer, as far as I'm aware, had always been in China, manufacturing their stuff in China. I don't know if they ever manufactured anything, in the U.S.
I think they're a German company, so it would have been Germany, but still, even
yeah. And Mackie had the 1604, was one of their best-selling products. It was a 16-channel, four bus mixer or whatever. It was a great little unit for a great price.
Yep.
And it was the thing that every, just sort of bedroom musician wanted next to their rig. It was just such a great device, and had all kinds of sort of professional level capabilities. And all of a sudden, Behringer came out with a product that was just very much the same, and was made in China. And the problem was that it was so the same. It turned out that it was actually pretty much identical. And so then, there was some suspicion, there was some stuff went on, and it was eventually determined that this was, reverse engineered Mackie mixer that was just manufactured in a different factory and was the exact same product.
So how does a company actually do that? How does a company, okay, I get you go to the store and you buy one and you take it back to the lab and you disassemble it, but how does one copy? Well, I mean, I don't want to give away the story that you're going to probably tell in a little bit,
Yeah.
But how does one copy things like the main board?
One of the things to keep in mind is this was an analog mixer. Uh, so there was no firmware, there was no encryption, there was none of these magic things that we assume everything has now.
Mm-hmm.
This was good old analog electronics that you could look at that circuit board and pretty much know how it worked.
Yeah.
It was not hard to figure out. It had silk screen that said, copyright Mackie or whatever, and it had the silk screen would even define. Back then, they didn't make as much effort to sort of obfuscate circuitry. Nowadays, you'll find where companies will actually source chips that aren't labeled and do weird things to make it harder to reverse engineer. Back then, there wasn't as much of that. They were buying parts that, the resistors had the color code on them. You could look and see what the value of that resistor was. And if you didn't know how to read the color code, a lot of times it would say right on the circuit board what the value was.
Right.
So,
Yeah, or you could just get the schematics or the diagrams. So you could fix these things because they actually made things to be repairable. So
yeah, I mean, I later owned an arcade and repaired a bunch of arcade machines that even 30-year-old machines, you can get the schematics for those things, and you could build your own if you had access to some of the sort of weirder parts that are in them. But in an analog mixer, none of the parts are weird.
Mm-hmm. I don't mean to jump to the end here, but just because we've kind of alluded to it several times, you got to tell that story.
The one about my friend.
Yes, the one with the broken thing.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I had a good friend. His name is Kyle. I worked with him on a couple of assembly lines there. He's now gone on to be a video game audio guy. He's made his whole career out of audio. And I actually lived with Kyle for a while. He was the first time I moved out of my parents' house was, this guy from the factory, and we moved into an apartment together and had great fun working at that place and sort of hanging out together. And Kyle was a very ambitious guy, and he had used the Mackie employee discount on the scratch and dent sort of B stock and C stock merchandise to build an entire studio in his dad's basement in Snohomish, Washington. He had this really awesome full-on professional quality studio. He had an HDR 2496. He had a digital 8 bus. He had all of this recording gear, and he had a band that they recorded their own album there. He recorded some other local bands there. He was just an audio nut. He was just into it. And in his giant pile of gear, he had this Behringer 1604 clone. And he acquired this, it was probably a, eBay deal or something back then. I don't know. Like I doubt he bought it new, but at some point he needed a cheap mixer to go to a gig or something. And so he picked one of these up, and at some point it failed. And it was a channel board that had failed, I think, if I remember right. He popped that channel board out of that Behringer mixer and took it to the assembly line in our factory that made 1604s. And I think the technician that he talked to, I think it was Qua. I think that was the name of the technician. If I remember the story right, that's who it was. And he walked up to him, and this guy had been working on this particular board for many years, like since this thing had come out. And the technicians that worked on those boards, some of them just worked on one board all the time. Some of them bounced around and worked on different lines. But this is a person who's an absolute expert on this particular circuit board. And so Kyle walked up and said, "Hey, this is from my mixer at home. Could you fix this for me real quick? It's got a dead channel or whatever." And he said, "Oh, sure, Kyle." And he pulled it onto his bench and fixed it real quick and started to hand it back to him. And then he said, "Wait a minute." And he pulled it back and he realized it said Behringer. So this is a guy that looks at this circuit board every day of his life, 10 hours a day, and stares up close under a magnifying glass at it. He can take it and replace parts on it without knowing that it was the ripped off Behringer board. So that's how identical it was. They had ripped off the silk screen and the layout and everything. They didn't make any effort to hide what they had done. It was just a copy.
So that's kind of the reason I wanted to jump ahead and tell that story, is because I don't think anything could possibly underscore more the degree to which they ripped off Mackie. Like you can say, oh, they ripped off Mackie. Oh, they just made a 16-channel mixer that was 4 buses. What's the big deal? No. They ripped off the circuit design to the point that a Mackie tech who's used to working on that board didn't realize he was working on a Behringer board until he had already fixed it.
Yeah, it would be like if you took a part off of your Chevy to a Ford dealership and had their maintenance tech look at it, and he didn't understand that it wasn't, one of theirs or whatever.
Right.
I mean, it's a crazy story.
Yeah. So
Yeah, that's crazy.
yeah. So with that level of just complete ripping off, what happened? Why wasn't it possible for Mackie to get damages out of Behringer?
Well, I think that I don't know the whole story. I know that a lot of it is sort of publicly out there. You can research this and get way nerdy into what went wrong with this case, but it's my understanding that the court just kind of tossed it like it wasn't something that was defendable. It was, if you can, take the screws off of a mixer and pull the circuit board out and look at it and know how to build one. At that time, in that case, the way that they tried to defend it, it was determined that Behringer hadn't really done anything wrong legally. There was even, I think, a push that, if nothing else, copying the silk screen might have been the copyright violation. Just the little white lines on the circuit board maybe could have been a thing that was defensible, but it wasn't. Like there wasn't any recourse for Mackie. And maybe that's partly because of Mackie was sort of expanding quickly, acquiring other companies. We had just chaos going on in the marketplace with 9/11 and all this other stuff. And I'm jumbling up the timeline there. This didn't all happen in the same year, but it was a sequence of events that led to those decisions to outsource that factory to China. It was a series of events that sort of led us there. But you have to wonder what would have happened differently had this Behringer thing not happened.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot easier to, say, hey, this is made in America by, people that are working right alongside with the design engineers. We've got, this great quality product. You can make the argument that it should be worth a few more bucks, unless you can get literally the exact same product for cheaper.
Yeah. Like exact down to the circuit. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's, I personally probably would try to direct it, try to direct my money that way. I do that with DeWalt, I think, and that's actually what started this conversation. Is we were talking in the channel, I think, 2 weeks ago, something like that, about DeWalt, how they make some of their stuff in the U.S. They assemble some of their stuff in the U.S., which is at least one step closer to actually being made in the U.S. Anyway, but that's what actually sparked my mind to having you on, to retell that story. So how do I put this? Well, so, okay, take us then through, okay, after all that stuff, then what happened at Mackie? If after, so Behringer's doing all this stuff, everything's moving overseas, from a production line standpoint. So what was the situation? Was people hair on fire? Oh my God, what's going on? Or what was it like?
I mean, I witnessed a lot of tragedy really all around me. There was, these Vietnamese and Laotian and Korean families working at this place. There was, Grandma Nora on the HDR 2496 line. She had worked for Mackie for 10 years or something. And all she knew how to do was build these things, and she was so great at it. She was a great assembler.
Mm-hmm.
And, her sons worked on that assembly line.
Yeah.
Sean and Mike, they worked on that assembly line too. And so, these families suddenly had issues with, immigration status and all this kind of stuff as that factory was winding down and they're laying people off. The best technician that I ever worked with in 22 years of working with technology was named Tree, and he was the dropout technician for that line.
Mm-hmm.
I talked to Tree right before the factory closed, and I asked him what he was going to go do, and he said he thought he was going to, work at a gas station or something. He didn't know where to go.
Oh my God.
And he was fantastic. I mean, this guy could do component level diagnosis and repair on circuit boards without the schematics, without the design. I mean, you could just hand him stuff and he just knew how everything was supposed to work. He was just one of those guys that he sort of had a sixth sense for it. And, I watched him fix an issue one time with a can of freeze spray, and he showed me this sort of magic trick with it. And I looked at it, I've used it since then many times. It was that kind of a place where you got to learn stuff like that on a daily basis. But, I remember the day when the NASDAQ delisting happened. That was a sad day. I remember the waves of layoffs. It was any time, any day of the week, anytime we knew that the factory was going to zero. And so, you would wonder, which 50 or 100 of your friends was going to get laid off, this month or whatever. And the supervisors were told, on a half a day's notice or whatever, hey, you need to make a list of 20 people, they're gone. And try to keep the people that have the sort of knowledge to keep the lines going. And it just became this chaotic mess.
Wow. So
even my friend Tom, who was one of Mackey's first employees, got laid off in that era. So it was something to see.
absolutely, yeah. So have you spoken to anybody that's still at Mackey?
So Tom was my main connection to the place for a long time. He became, kind of one of my best friends, and now that he's passed away, I've kind of lost my connection to some of those people. A lot of the Vietnamese and Laotian people, I didn't, so many of them, their lives changed so dramatically. They probably, weren't even living in that area anymore. A few of them I did run into from time to time. I know that, my buddy Sean, who was on that line as a tester, he, last I knew, was working as a table games dealer at a casino up in Washington.
Wow.
But it's, we thought that, I don't know what everybody else thought, but I thought that I was going to just do that kind of work for my whole life.
Wow.
And we found that wasn't a thing.
Mm-hmm.
We would go to job interviews. We'd sit in the waiting room, and you'd look around and you'd see a bunch of people that you worked with at Mackey sitting in that same waiting room, trying to get the same seat in the same factory down the road. I was never able to sort of get into, I didn't have the college part, and I didn't get into the medical devices. There's still some medical device manufacturing around, but everything else disappeared.
So have you heard of any of that starting to come back in the last, not even just the last 4 years, but in the last several years? Have you heard about any of that starting to come back, or?
Yeah, there are interesting things that happen more now. And of course, I've moved on, and I work as an IT engineer now. And I did a bunch of other stuff in between. I was a low voltage electrician, did other things, but I do now get contacted by recruiters looking to hire me to work in an electronics factory in Woodinville, Washington. So a little bit of something's going on, but usually it's that medical stuff or aerospace stuff. Of course, Boeing is up there, and so there's a lot of jobs for that kind of stuff. Of course, Boeing is really in bad shape right now. So, there's some ups and downs to all of those things. The last time I had an interview for that type of work up there, before I moved, there was an ultrasound. It was an ultrasound probe repair place that was right down the road from where the Mackey factory had been. It was they were looking for people that could repair the inner stuff in an ultrasound probe, and I went and interviewed for that. The guy that did my solder test, the guy that administered my, they said, do you know how to solder under a microscope? And I said, yes, even though I didn't. And I went and soldered some connections under a microscope. The guy that looked at my connections to see if they were good or not, he turned and looked at me and said, you worked at Mackey, didn't you? And so turned out, 18 years later or whatever, he was a guy that had worked at Mackey.
Yeah, that's a thing, actually. Like, people are able to tell who worked on a certain thing just by, the way that something is soldered. Was there a special way that people soldered things at Mackey? Was there like a standard?
That's a good question. I think he actually recognized me, but he wasn't sure. And then once we talked about products we worked on, then he was sure. But I did get surface mount soldering certified at Mackey. They had their own internal certification, and I did get that back then. So there probably is some style in there that came from that training.
That's really cool. Yeah, they can even use that. From what I understand, in like if they find an explosive device or something like that, they can look at the way that wires are connected together and kind of build basically a fingerprint of who likely made that. Like, after they, if they find uh, uh, several things in your particular shed in the middle of North Dakota, they they can go back and say, oh, this guy here also, these devices here were also probably made by that same guy in that same shed in North Dakota.
That microscope soldering test was really a weird thing because the wire in an ultrasound probe is so tiny. I mean, it's like a human hair or whatever, and
Wow.
you're trying to make these little tiny solder joints. And actually, the technician lead for that place, he pulled me aside and he said, "I know you lied. I know you've never done this before." And I said, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Your first connection was terrible. Your second one would have worked, and your third one I would have let go out the door. It would have been fine." He's like, "You must have done a lot of this at some point." I said, "Well, I used to work right down the road at Mackey," and then he kind of understood that that whole area in that neighborhood, if you were an electronics technician, a tester, an assembler, any of that kind of stuff, if you worked, in the late 90s or early 2000s, you probably worked there at some point.
That's amazing. So looking back then, now it's a lot easier to look back and say, okay, well, if only we would have done this or that or whatever, right? Is there something that could have been done in order to move things in a different direction, in order to save those jobs, in order to keep the quality up, all that stuff? Is there something that could have been done to do that?
Uh, Nothing from my point of view as the tester in the factory, but certainly I think that Mackey got on its heels and was sort of backpedaling for that last era of their American manufacturing, sort of, that time that I worked there and maybe a year or two before that. I think that they were in a situation where, they were a little behind their competitors. The engineering problems that they had going to China, I think ultimately kind of killed the brand. I mean, you still, see Mackey with the little running man and not the name, but I mean, those are everywhere. And so that product is still successful. But the company as we knew it certainly died, in that era right when I left. And I think that a lot of that was due to the quality issues they had going to China. So I wish that they hadn't been trying to acquire those other companies. I think that put them in a weaker spot. I wish we would have figured out a way to buy transducers and speakers without buying the manufacturers that made those things, because I think that kind of tapped them out. I think that the digital products were cool and we came out with some really great stuff, but I think it was kind of too much too fast, and they had always been designing analog stuff. They didn't know the ins and outs of digital yet. I think that if they would have legged into that a little bit slower and maybe not invested in some of the things they invested in, maybe they could have survived to sort of fight another day, and maybe it would have been different. I don't know.
Yeah, because when you have when you have a completely different set of skills, which is what you would need for that, right? If you are going from through hole manufacturing all the way into the world where you need to make your own OS for a thing, that's a significant like skill up, tool up. That's a significant increase to your costs in general. So it sounds to me like if you could go back in time and someone waves a magic wand and says, "Come here, kid, get off that testing line. You're in charge of Mackie now." If you could do that, it sounds to me like your prescription would be go with what you know. You guys do analog really well. Stick with that. You bought the company to do that. Do that.
I think that we needed to move into digital stuff. I mean, I think that they've had successful digital products. To be honest, I don't really follow audio stuff anymore because it's sort of depressing to me in a way. But
I believe it. Yeah.
I think that they needed some digital products, but I think that they started with like the biggest digital product thing ever was the D8B. and the digital 8 bus was a crazy piece of engineering. And it worked pretty well. I mean, it was a good product, and you still see those out there sometimes in venues and stuff. And the HDR was another just massive undertaking. I think that there was just so many of those things. There was just, I think that you maybe could have legged into digital a little slower, at least from my point of view in the factory. I don't know the business side of things. I don't know the stock market side of things and all the, trade agreements and all that other stuff. But from my point of view in the factory, it was just too chaotic trying to do all of that at once and figure out all at once that, like I said, even just the ESD issues. I mean, once you start grounding people, then you've got safety issues to deal with. I had to tap a test engineer lead on the shoulder one day and say, the guy doing the high pot test, the 3,000 volt test at the end of the line, he shouldn't be wearing an ESD wrist strap, because if that unit fails that test and he touches it, he's going to be in trouble. And well, they didn't know that stuff. They had never dealt with it before. So I don't know. It's hard to say what would have been different, but I think that taking it easy on that ultra fast move into digital, but they had to do that partly because of the Behringer thing. I mean, they were, like I say, they were on their heels. They were fighting for their life at that point.
Yeah. So I guess that, to tie in with our main theme there, that is kind of an interesting thing, especially when we get to the second subject, because right around that time is right when the DMCA, the Digital Millennial Copyright Act, came out, right? So as they are putting the flipping screws, I mean, you want to hear a sad story? I should tell you guys sometimes about Bismarck E and the crap that he went through. The song "It's Spring Again." I'll tell you now. There was a song called "It's Spring Again," and he sampled just a little piano loop from somewhere. It's like not that big of a part of the song, and at the time, sampling was just fine. Like it was. Yes, you are infringing copyright, but no one cared. Well, this was one of the first songs where someone cared, and they nailed him to the flipping wall. It was terrible, like what they did to Bismarck. That's one of the reasons that, like, well, I don't know. I don't want to speculate like that, but he was in bad financial shape for a long time. Is basically where I'm going with that. And it's sad because he was like one of the legends of hip hop, like absolute legend. And but for him to be starving because some guy, sued him over a couple seconds worth of piano loop, was it within his rights to do so? Yeah, but you could have worked it out to where it was like a share of the profits or something like that. You don't need to hurt him like that. But anyway,
being a Linux guy trying to play DVDs on a Linux box in that era, I was very familiar with the DMCA. And until you said it, I had never really thought about that being kind of the same era. And I wonder if that drove Mackie to be digital a little bit after the analog circuitry got ripped off by Behringer. Maybe they wanted to move to a product that had its own OS that could be protected in that way. That's interesting. I had never really thought about that.
Very well could be. But at the time, the way it was though was that music was just and technology and DVDs. Oh my God, the DVD code thing. Oof. But the screws were getting tightened on that. But at the same time, an electronics manufacturer in America is able to have his whole entire board design completely ripped off. To the point where it still just boggles my mind that a technician is able to work on a board by a different manufacturer and doesn't realize he's doing it. Like, just astounding. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Oh, any final thoughts before we sign off for this hour? We do have the post game coming up. Anybody want the last word here?
No, I suppose back in that day, like it's probably a 2-layer board as well for that. So that's incredibly easy to copy.
Yeah, for the analog boards, I don't know specifically, but I'm pretty sure you're right. I'm pretty sure a lot of those were 2-layer boards. Certainly later on, we had some stuff that was multi-layer, and I think that when we bought Acuma Labs for that sync board in the HDR 2496, I think that might have been the most layers that had ever been on one of our boards, but I don't remember how many.
Anything before we head out?
No.
Oh, okay.
Nothing from me.
Cool. Well,
I appreciate the opportunity to sort of rehash my my favorite era of my career that was 2 decades ago.
Absolutely. No, I like I said, we went to a local restaurant here like about a year ago, and he